So we'll just spend a little bit of time going through some of the kind of pain-based, some of the pain-based kind of studies we can look at perhaps, and information we can share, some kind of videos, and then a little bit like we had yesterday to give that balance. And I hope most of what we discussed the last 2 days is an attempt to kind of provide a balance in many ways. That's certainly what I try and do in most education. That there's many ways of doing these things. It may not be for all, but it could be for some, is the approach I try and take. So I always try and give that balance view, and I'm very much into you as the audience. You've got good intellect, that's very evident. And I think that's been established quite clearly the last 2 days in particular, that you've got good education, you've got great intellect. For me, it's use your own autonomy, your own understanding now to figure out what helps, what doesn't help. So I'm the world's worst salesman in a good way, I hope. That this is just my experiences, what I've been very blessed and Lomec continue to be exposed to. But you go and figure out in your own way based on what you've been exposed to. Not sure about that, that's okay. That may be quite helpful. And that's kind of really my way, perhaps, to try and encourage you to look at this stuff. So just to kind of give that balance again, to really connect back with the, when we looked at the movement base, the anatomy yesterday, is to kind of look at some pretty historical movements that can connect back to pain. Very much like the story that David and I kind of shared then around the young lady a few years ago with the wrist pain. That pain is a very hard predictor, very tough one to say accurately that will create pain, David, or resolve pain. You take the approach, let's see and let's hope. But the see and the hope are based on really historical science and case study history, but you never quite know until you've actually spent time with someone how they adapt. And it really goes back to, it really goes back to what we said yesterday. There's two types of humans, responders and non-responders. Some guys respond different to the long drink. I had a very bad response for that reason. So it's just how you respond to any stimulus you receive. So you can give information to player A, you have a wonderful response. The same feedback to player B, a quite problematic one. So much of your role is to kind of figure out what they respond well to, and then equally so, what they respond less to. But these are just going to show a couple of videos, actually, some pretty, pretty unhelpful movements, and certainly things which I've been exposed to over years. And much of this stuff really came from, these are kind of younger, these are both, or were both at the time, junior national players, so I can only imagine very comparable to what we saw with the ladies and the few boys we saw back in March. These are now beyond juniors. These are actually 3 or 4 years old, these videos, but I still use them. When you have things like conceptual or perceptual-based issues, how they try and produce distance, rather than looking at actually what movements actually create length. The influencers say the dominant dad, as it was in this case, David, with the second one, that this is actually not the young lady, this is a different young lady with a very, very dominant parent, that he's right, I'm wrong, and I'll tell you why, that approach to life, which is fine. But just some of the stuff you can see, then we'll actually start to look at these movements individually as to how to get back to pain. So, I mean, this guy was just all about hit it as far as you can. It's about distance, the kind of typical kind of young male ego, which we all have, it's just the way it is. And but actually how he produced that club head speed was perhaps not advisable. So let me just play this. And in particular, look around that kind of left foot, left knee, as he moves for impact. And then I'll play that through once again, and how he responds then through hand and wrist. And that the kind of, it's not a sad thing, I don't know what the word is actually, you get to that kind of time 2 days in, you kind of forget how to describe things, but I suppose it is sad in some ways that they both coach and player saw no issue with this. They were like, what's the problem? That's a very different discussion. Their perception is and was that this is how the best players apparently move. Okay, we've clearly been exposed to different groups of good players then, but both coach and player looked at me and went, what's the issue? And that's a very, very, goes back to our discussion, which I love, by the way. That's a whole different approach then, that their perception is, and their expectation is, the expectation is it creates no issues, and their perception is this is good movement. I'll play it through once again. That just you take the approach sometimes, guys. Where do you start with this stuff? When you got a guy coming in moving like this, and really, where do you start some days? And for me, it has to go back to. I'll just quickly tell you this. It's still one of my favorite approaches. How do you want to use your time today? This is your time. This is your information. How would you like to use it? So to help me help you, how do you want to use your time today? And no one ever goes by doing nothing. So very much to the boys. I know thank you, by the way, guys, for doing this today. It's different for the boys, but when they come in for a session, it's your information, it's your time. How would you like to use it today? And I'll talk about this a little bit. We'll go through some fun kind of approaches, kind of philosophies that I try and use. And a lot of it connects back to why I really dislike the word practice. It's a very popular word, I'm sure, used in most training camps in most nations. You've actually looked at what practice means. It means to reinforce what you currently do. That's the English definition of practice. So I would take the approach to the guys when they come in for sessions, what would you like to learn today, boys? Not aimed at you two personally, but what would you like to learn today? No one ever goes nothing. So rather than saying, how do you want to practice and that kind of stuff, when you come and see Hank today, for example, what would you like to learn? And they go, wow, yeah, I'd love to learn about this. Great, that's a great place to start then. So I would sooner replace, let's go and practice today, with what would you like to learn today? So just how you kind of, in some ways, frame the question really shifts their perception of what the session could then be. But just watch this young lad again, because it really is a pretty average move, which is why I kept this one. Around the adaptation through his wrist, through neck, because of what that foot, knee, and hip do. But they thought it was all good. So it was like, good luck with that approach. In a fun way. Equally so with this young lady. I haven't blanked her face out because it's very dark. This is up at St Andrews a few years ago, for those that are very aware of the background. And this was the dominant dad. It looked at me and went, what do you know about anything? How do I answer that question? That was his approach, David. What do you know about anything? Well, I'll let you decide that over time, really, but how do you answer those questions? And so I try and give a balance. Sessions aren't always great. They're not always romantic. They're quite problematic sometimes. There's normally, in any training camp, which I guess the guys have been around, there's normally one which is a little bit kind of prickly and a bit kind of abrasive and a bit challenging. And they can be the fun ones, because when you do shift them this way, it's actually quite a pleasant feeling that they come into the session really, what do you know about anything? And they've walked out going, yeah, I'd maybe like to do that again at some point. For me, they're actually more enjoyable than having guys that are just all romantically happy about things. So having a slightly abrasive one sometimes can be pretty cool. This was a very dominant dad. It, again, perceived his daughter to be the next Lydia Ko, and to my knowledge, she's yet to move past Lydia's record. This is 5 years ago, this video, so I don't think she's gone past Lydia's outstanding record of tournament golf. Again, just how she moves through impact around typical young adolescent player. I mean, you could discuss backswing all day if you wish as well. But the dad was like, this is my daughter's the new Lydia Ko, so I'm not sure how Lydia feels about being referenced against that as well, because she's clearly a very outstanding young lady, as in Lydia Ko. But so you get these. It's not always a romantic world we live in. This is the reality of most players. It's your fault, boys. I'm only kidding. It's your fault. But, the reality is, yeah, dominant parents and coaches' egos, and that applies to me. It applies to all of us. And their acceptance to think that perhaps they can improve David again. Acceptance, another big word we could actually include in that kind of perception expectation discussion. That until you win the Open Championship, you're not that good, are you, really, if you think about it? So until you've gone and beat Lydia and beat these guys, then we can keep improving still. Okay, so let's just go through a couple of... No, it's another lady. The other one I dismiss. She can go away. Well, she's actually a wonderful young lady. The dad's just whatever. You can bleep this on camera. Yeah, that's fine. His ego gets in the way, unfortunately, but she's actually a delightful young lady. This is another, just happens to be another female player, not for any reason apart from, I kind of keep the real videos that make me go, okay, why do I do this stuff? But I want to go to now just some kind of real, a bit like yesterday, but in a different way. That was a picture of a ganglion, Mate Few, that happened on someone's wrist, and just through poor movement, a lot of movement through their wrist, and that fluid release, the build-up of a ganglion in the end. And the guy was like, oh yeah, I've seen this. I thought it might have been a problem. Completely, in a lovely romantic way, so unaware. The guy from the north of England was like, yeah, I wonder what that was. He goes and dismissed it and carried on. And I'm completely unaware that it may not be advisable, but just that scale of human being, just the most delightful kid. And thought it was just, yeah, he goes. I thought I need a picture of this because it's a good one. So, I mean, let's do a bit of a very quick walk. So I know the boys are very kindly given up their afternoon to come and act as models today. So we'll spend a bit of time going through, again, hopefully making very meaningful what we've discussed, some of the distance-based stuff perhaps, and even connect it back to yesterday so we can really start to tie the 2 days, we hope now, to perhaps what the two boys do this afternoon. But we'll just go through a couple of fun bits here to finish. So as far as the neck, I mean, really, if you look at problematic movements, if there's kind of one movement we can really look to avoid with every segment, the neck really is kind of when the neck is moving clockwise in downswing, as that rib cage is moving anti-clockwise. So I think there's wonderful references of Henrik Stenson, Allenby from a generation DJ perhaps is the most relevant one now, Annika Sorensen, those guys. That DJ, like we said yesterday, almost when the club's halfway down, is actively looking pretty much along the ball flight line. Even Tiger, you look at kind of Tiger even 10 years ago. So the kind of Tiger won the Masters last year, whether it's an active response or it's just a response in a very unaware way, now how Tiger is now much more how that head rib cage rotate in a line in a much more matched way through impact. So as far as kind of typical neck pain stuff, almost going back to the young lad we saw yesterday, invariably when you see that, it's just not helpful. And it really goes back to David's good question, like we said before lunch there, that pain has to allow for resilience, tolerance, sensitivity. To really even expand on that, if I got a pain in my left hip, as an example, I might go, oh, my hip's a bit stiff today, dismiss it, because I've never, thankfully, had a pain in my left hip. If my right shoulder aches, it's like, oh no, not again, because of the associated memories attached to pain. So even again, you look at pain science, at how we scale pain, like we mentioned briefly yesterday, if my shoulder's a bit sore on a Monday, the Open Championship, it's a Monday morning. If it's sore on a Sunday morning on the last day, I'll be really panicking because how I perceive that pain to be. There's even been some really good studies. There's a guy, what's his name? Lorne. Really good. YouTube is good for some things still. There's a really good YouTube. What's his name? I'll find it for you. Does a great talk around prosthetic limbs, that pain is very much also a perception. That you've had guys that have a prosthetic, say they've unfortunately lost, say, that one leg as an example, and they then touch that prosthetic leg onto a hot plate and go, ouch, because they perceive it to hurt. Obviously, there's no nerve endings, there's no receptors in the skin, there's no nerve endings in the prosthetic, but because they see it as hot, they go, that's painful. So there's a really lot of science around pain science and perception of pain. It's like young babies. If you say to a young baby, don't touch it, it's hot, they'll do what? For that reason. So you actually say to young kids, what do you think may happen if you touch that? And then you think about it. So how you word the question to younger people. I was saying to some of the guys walking down to the lunch center, why do babies keep reproducing movements that hurt? Because they haven't yet got dominant memories. They haven't quite formed those memories at those early days that if I keep jumping off the sofa, I might bump my head at some point. It's only when we start to develop memories through life we go, maybe I won't jump off the sofa now. But so you kind of say to the kids, if you touch that, what could happen? and just see how they're responding, which really then forms much of my approach. You say to players, if you stand that way, or with the young lady, if you keep moving that way, what do you think may happen now? And that's another way, in some ways, of having them also own the problem. Oh yeah, if I do that, yeah, okay. Might need to look at this. If you said don't do that, they'd dismiss it. So just often how you word things and kind of configure it and frame it can really shift how people then respond again, perceive. So if you say don't touch it, there's no perception created. If you say what do you think may happen, they have to then actively go, So just ways you can look at this stuff. So the neck really, look to avoid that one kind of movement. That's not particularly helpful. The wrist, really, we could really spend a morning or an afternoon on the wrist. I purposely actually removed the wrist stuff from yesterday and today because there were other areas that I'd like to teach. Going back to the start of yesterday, I thought it might be more helpful for you, but obviously you'll decide that, not me, to really ignore the wrist stuff. That's maybe something we can do another time, perhaps, if we're lucky to do this. And I thought there'd be better areas that we could look at. But really, it's going to look at the wrist. Again, very generic. Apologies for the real generic feedback. There's so much more we have to consider. And obviously, I think you all know that anyway. Typically, when there's wrist pain in the trail wrist, look at what happens in transition. There's a lot more to it than this. Of course there is, but this is real, almost a 2-minute review of wrist pain. It would be a 2-year review. The movement it really dislikes is when it goes into excessive extension and radial deviation. So thumbs up, wrist back. So in essence, I'll do it so both sides can see. Would be the trail wrist, and then for the guys on this side of the room, that extended thumb up position. So like Mate, and I was saying how you get like scaphoid, lunate, capitate damage all through that wrist because of the compression, the bones being driven downwards, and then they're being separated, the ligament tears, compression around the scaphoid, those real common areas that we can have in that trail wrist. And then equally so, if there's a lead wrist issue, one of those typically post-impact, a bit like, unfortunately, the young lady and the young guy post-impact how much the forearm supinates, how much the wrist extends, and again, back into that very ulnar thumb-up position. Even playing with these movements, they give you some awareness of this. So, again, play with it. You don't have to. It's just, if you're comfortable doing this, everyone kind of point the thumb. I need caffeine. Everybody point the little finger downwards, then go into that flex position, then wrap the wrist under. You may start to feel a little bit of activity, compression around that part of the wrist. Some may not. That's often what happens when we move this way through that trail wrist through impact. So often why you get so much, say, cartilage issue matter, that TFCC through here, because those kind of movements that we often experience in swing. Yes, sir. That dreaded word should again. Good. I told you, no one ever listens, do they? Good. Absolutely, yes. Absolutely right. Yeah? Yeah. That's actually a good observation. So let's spend some time around this 1 second. But there is really, there's typically, look at it very crudely, there's really only 2 wrist movements we really have. So ulnar radial deviation, little finger down, thumb up, and then extension flexion. This pronation, supination is the forearm. So when we talk about wrist rotation, well, in an informal environment, there's no such thing. But this is rotation, that's rotation, just around which axes would be the more accurate definition. What rotates the hand is the forearm, the big radius rotating around the fixed ulna, the pronation, supination. Actually, what influences significantly the pronation and supination is how the wrist moves. So again, let's all play with this. So to answer your question, yes, that how the wrist moves typically is a reason, not the only reason, but a reason why the forearm would then either pronate or supinate, which would then really put excessive load in length or length tension on those epicondyles, the bones on the outside of the elbow, which then creates inflammation, tennis elbow, golf elbow, that kind of stuff. So if everybody kind of just puts their hands in that fairly kind of thumbs up, kind of call it what you want, neutral position. If you go thumb up and extend the wrist, intrinsically that forearm will pronate. Everyone look at the long bone, the big radius bone. If you go thumb up and extend, so a combination of radial deviation and wrist extension will create internally a pronation of the forearm. Equally so, little finger down on the flexion, the forearm will then respond in supinate. So much of the wrist, forearm, I should say, pronation, supination movements are just responding to how the wrist moves. So to really understand forearm rotation, as you so rightly say about tennis elbow and golfer's elbow, we need to look at what the wrist does. Try and pronate the forearm as you go into ulnar deviation and flexion. And you can do it, but it kind of looks a bit, it's not a movement you'd associate with golf. It might be if you kind of have to bend under the sofa and pick something up like so, you might get a bit of that. But then you look at, going back to what we discussed earlier on, that the idea of the affordances. Often they get very precise postures at the most distal end, so the fingers. We have to go through really adapted and very unusual postures at the most proximal end. So to get very precise finger and thumb position, I'm having to really... So just the next time you have to bend under your sofa to pick something up from underneath it, to get really precise finger position, we go through really adaptive postures through here to kind of do that. Good example being, say, dentists. I mean, really precise finger. Surgeons would be another great example. Really precise finger movement, but they get in some pretty funny positions to do this stuff. In mate, we'll notice more than most. Some of the worst postures you see would be in manual therapists, perhaps, because they're always fair. As I build it, well, you're a Finnish icon. You're a bad example. Where do you keep the red carpet, Henrique? Just kind of roll out here. Yeah. He is the Finnish icon. And but a lot of it's like builders often have the worst houses because they're spending so much time on what they do. And so a lot of elbow pain. Your first response would be, let's see how the wrists are moving. Beg your pardon? Yeah. So you're going to look at it more, I mean, again, this kind of then really connects into Mate and the other physios and the trainers, that you look at the idea of kind of passive range and active range. So how much range can they produce actively, and then how much range can then be produced passively through those joints. This is still, for me, one of the best use of, say, the 3D data. So quite often, I normally only do this with the wrist, actually. You might say, how much active range can that player produce in that wrist? So say, for example, even using me as a bad example, I can get close to 90 degrees of wrist flexion, and I can get about 50 degrees of wrist extension. One of my better ones to look at is actually radial deviation of the wrist. So 20, 25 degrees orthopedically is what people like me typically have. You then look at what they produce in swing when there's the external forces, the weight of the club, so that they're passively being poured into these huge ranges. You look at really how aligned are those movements, what they can produce themselves versus what they're being taken through because of the weight of the club, the force on the club, gravity, acceleration, adaptation elsewhere. So that's a great question, by the way. That's a nice way of using 3D data for me. Are they being taken through ranges much bigger than anatomically that they can produce actively themselves? And it's probably one of the other reasons why I get so much wrist pain again, going back to the kind of the discussion there, that I could maybe get 25 degrees if I try, but if I really, really force my wrist in some pretty unpleasant positions, it can go maybe into the 30s. So we now know that how you're moving in swing, excuse me, sorry guys, how we're moving in swing is taking that joint through a much bigger range that it actually has really available. So yes, a great way of using it. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Yes, sir. Yeah. 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 Change it or improve it. And but even I mean even I'm very awake. There's that slightly caffeine-induced tea there. You kind of look at that in a few ways as well, David. That the coach may not want to improve it, but the player may if he's asked the right question. So again, we've made the assumption they don't want to improve. Where's that assumption? Kind of our own experiences, our own fear, our own expectation. If I mention this, she may not like me. So until we actually ask the question in such a way that goes, okay, let's start to kind of make this connection now. In some ways, it's almost like the synapses in the brain, the junctions in the brain. Can we start to create new ones, which is what perception does? If we ask the question in such a way that, okay, a young lady in this case, based on how you currently hold it, how do you think that connects back to why you get the issues that you have? Would be how I would word that. So based on how you currently place your hands on the club, you connect that back to why you find certain movements problematic and why you move that way. Okay, yeah, so maybe if I'm holding it like that, that might connect back. Great. So you now show me, if I came to you moving this way, how would you help me adjust my hand position? Well, I'd get you doing that. Well, maybe there's your answer then. So one approach I'll often take is, based on that little discussion, if I came to you moving this way, how would you help me? Well, I'd have you do that, and that. Sometimes it just needs to be what you call rhetorical. They need to answer their own question. But I have a tremendous conflict around grips. Essentially, every movement in life is controlled by the fingers. Fingers control everything we do in life, pretty much. How we go through space to grab objects. Even just only with the hands crossed, it will still be the fingers that go first to cross the elbows. Or how do we pick up the ball? How do we clean our teeth? How do we eat? Go back to the paleo, the cavemen of fingers in our mouth. You look at when babies evolve and develop, once they can push themselves up, the first thing they do is what? Put their fingers in their mouth. Because it's survival. So you look at perception in its truest format, perception is touch. I could say to that young lady, can you describe that bottle for me? Right, it's kind of green and a bit circular, and you touch and go, oh, okay, so touch is our truest form of perception still. Golfers call that feel. So how you place your hands on the club, how you wrap, you look at, everyone just close their hands for me. Our hands are inherently designed to, the fingers wrap, the thumb compresses. The thumb has one less joint in the fingers for a reason. If you look at it closer, we only have really one joint here. We have two in the fingers. The fingers are designed to wrap, the thumb is designed to compress. So how the hands are designed through should actually guide us as to how to hold the club. The fingers wrap, the thumb compresses. I'm curious as to why golf ever did that. I don't know any real, you go back to the paleo man of striking, chopping trees, all these kind of axe movements, which is survival again. We hold it this way. So why have we gone to? But you don't let go of the axe, do you? At least you shouldn't. Unless you want to keep your arms, you probably wouldn't. But I think the idea of 8 fingers. I wouldn't be surprised if you see more people going 8 fingers and 2 thumbs. I think you'll start to see more people over life looking at it like this, rather than. So again, a lot of it comes back to why we do that conventions. Historically, that's how we're told to play, So go back to that, why we move the way we do, that's a convention. That's how we're taught to play golf. Perpetual thinking. I was taught that way, therefore. You look at coaching. Most of our coaching values are based on our own perceived failures. We coach based on what we perceived prevented us from being good at golf. So if you really honestly now think about things on the way home, much of your own coaching values that you have will be based around what you perceived to have failed at 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago as a player. Why do guys teach short game? Because they weren't very good at short game. So most of our coaching values connect back to what we perceived we failed at in life. So yeah, so that's perpetual thinking. I was taught that way, therefore I'll do it as well. Conventions within that, the hierarchy of movement. I'd just be curious, but even on a deeper level, David, all it's called fascial connections, glue that kind of sticks it together. They all connect into the fingers. Another example for you, but I can't think which ones it is now. I think it's index finger. Index finger connects back to pronation, supination. So if everyone puts their hands in this position, you just rotate the forearms, kind of get a reference for that. Now completely bend your index finger in that position. Now rotate your forearms. Feel very different? Extend your fingers again. Every finger connects back to movement in the body. There's actually two Italians that kind of really mapped these years ago, that things like the index finger connects back to flexion of the trunk, rib cage, that a finger connects back to, say, dorsiflexion of the feet. So fingers are so important, but it goes back to survival. When babies learn, everything we do is how we use our fingers still, fingers and eyes. So the way you place that on the club is so important. My conflict is, it's such a historical, deep memory, how we hold it. Interesting, Marcus yesterday, I've always held like that for such a powerful observation he made, that he's done it since, so there's a belief attached to that. This is how I hold the club, and therefore don't shift it. Done in a very discreet way, Davey. Okay, let's look at your neck and your rib cage then, Marcus. Yeah, my hands are different now, so okay, so maybe I need to do this. So you've actually improved the way he holds it in a very unaware, very implicit way. He's got better without knowing about it. That's how I normally do that stuff. But normally it's that. If I came to you holding it like that, how would you help me? They normally always go, no one ever goes, I'd leave you alone. People are pretty good at that. Okay, I mean, the spine, we kind of talked a little bit about that yesterday, but really kind of two movements. It's avoiding a dominance in either extension or lateral flexion in backswing. So it's having fairly equal amounts of both, all being well. So as you rotate, it's having that equal amount of kind of extension and lateral bend in the spine. And then really in transition is almost then equally again. Having fairly kind of fairly matched values that through transition, through impact, that there's not a dominance in, say, forward flexion, lateral flexion, or rotation. This can we get a fairly matched spine or rib cage movement in kind of all three directions. So not a dominance in, like the young lady previously, a lot of flexion in the spine. I'm stiff today. Nice flexion, or a lot of rotation, as we often can see with some of the kids these days. It's close to, yeah. Yeah. Excuse me. It's more that you as close you can retain the natural curves in the spine. The spine's a big S, wonderful S shape. You've got those three main curves: the curve of the neck, so the lordosis of the neck, the kyphosis of the thoracic spine, and the lordosis of the lumbar spine. You really want to avoid real changes in either one of those segments or more than one. So, yeah, to you and I, the spine looks straight. As Martin is a big S curve we have. So how close-ish, so from the target line view for you there, oops, that's why I was making the windy noise, so I just discovered that, which is what those things do apparently. So from downswing, as it rotates, as best we can, keeping that lovely shape to the spine. Again, it's just how you create perception again. A straight spine, or just keep the curves in the spine. Just reflect on that for 30 seconds. What's a more playful, exploratory, one you can relate to perhaps better? If I say give you a straight spine at impact, or let's just keep those curves as you move through impact. Hopefully the second one's a much more less demanding response to play with, possibly. So yeah, good question. Good question. I put kind of hips down, but pelvis, hips, you can kind of look at it either way. The kind of main two I look at to avoid kind of hip-based kind of issues. We spoke about this a little bit yesterday, so I'll do it from behind. The idea that the right side elevated in transition, very much that right side moving upwards. A lot of it connects back to the younger guys that they haven't yet got that wonderful control in their frame. So they're good at moving, and not particularly good at really controlling those joints. And then very much through the lead hip, the idea of that left hip being, like we discussed this morning, being pushed down so that left knee really gets outside, left ankle, left hip. Look at somebody, again, I've never met Tiger, don't know what he does. I'm an observationist now. We look at a lot of his left side pain he had way back when. That knee getting outside, the foot and hip having to really adapt. Certainly one area I think he's improved in recent times, just an observation. He's much more now ankle, knee, hip and alignment and impact. And again, it's only an observation, the ones that I really see, and also the ones that I've been around, that when that knee gets outside, they've often got their wrist taped, and there's pain somewhere, or they've had real problems, like some of the players you see in recent times that have missed large parts of the season for that reason. Knees connect back to that, kind of feet and ankles really go back to that as well. So just before I kind of do a quick walkthrough, I know the boys are here, so in about 25 minutes, boys, we'll start with you guys. I rarely show data to people, and I even thought about this knowing it might be recorded, but I kind of thought about it. I think it'd be nice to do something. I'm very sensitive over information. I don't really, despite being asked to kind of mention names, it's just not me, unfortunately. Sorry, I'm not into kind of publicly. But it's still one of my favorite videos I've been very privileged to be around in my life. And it really, for me, in this sort of 2-minute video, really reflects the last 2 days. And this is Danny Willett. I've been lucky to know Danny for a long time, maybe 10, 12 years now. I've had the great pleasure of knowing Dan and working with Dan. Just one of the best kids on the planet. It's the reason why he wins the Masters in the PGA and that kind of stuff. And this would have been maybe 10 years ago now. And it's still one of my favorite videos. I've still been lucky to actually be in the session. And because it really reviews everything we've discussed in the last 2 days. How well he stands. And I'm going to play this in a second. You can watch it. Connecting back to the coaching observations that the ladies mentioned around you can lose weight, but it makes no difference until you start to join those dots. So the importance of wonderful posture, wonderful control, making exercises, if you want to call it that, very task-based. A lot of guys, when they do squats, go, I get that, but how's it helping me get better at this? There's no relevance, no connection, no meaningful value. Using mirrors for that movement awareness. Can I be a real pain in the ass if no one can film this video? Otherwise, I won't show. I'm going to be a real pain. If anyone's videoing this, please, out of respect, don't video this personally. Just his perception, the intent, the intention of video when you look in. You can do it because it's different, but I hope for you won't put this on Instagram or sell it. I just got to be very sensitive. So I apologize for being a real pain, guys, but if you could really be respectful, that would be great for this one. Just how he uses mirrors, the intent. Watch his eyes at the end. This guy, anything can happen. He wouldn't be away. He's so into what he does. Just the quality of movements. You look at everything we discuss, posture, awareness, intent, perception, connecting back to coaches, movement. This video does everything. So I'll play it through. You can watch it yourself, and I hope you get out of it what I get out of it every time so I was lucky to be around this, and it's a bit wavy, the camera at one point, but just watch the brilliant video. Doing this kind of posture drills, his awareness drills, and through his physio, then coming into his golf coach, making it about coaching now. How can we use all those references of the physio was doing into golf coaching, so making it meaningful, coach connection. And he goes to the mirror now. That right arm we discussed, elbow beneath shoulder. Look at his eye in the mirror. Doesn't blink. And you wonder why some guys are good. No one tells him ever what he'll always be there before you, and he'll always work harder than you, and he'll always demand more from you. And there's a reason why people like him are very, very good at what they do. Just that, the intent of, okay, what does it mean to me to do this? Okay, when I do that, how can that help me win at Augusta? Okay, right, I kind of get that connection. Okay, I've got that. Going back to his golf coach, what they've discussed, connect them back to his posture-based drills. Okay, I need to get better control of that shoulder, okay, for the tubing. Just when you look at it for what it really is, it's 2 days of discussion, really. I think it's just the best video ever I've been around. When you look at the real deep value of what's happening in that video.